The world knows Chuck Norris as the invincible warrior, the man who could roundhouse kick through steel, the legend who never lost a fight and never showed weakness. But what they don't know is the truth behind those cold eyes, the devastating reality that even America's toughest man couldn't fight his way out of the nightmare that would destroy everything he ever loved. At 85 years old, Chuck Norris isn't the hero you remember. He's a broken man, watching his wife slowly fade away from a medical disaster that stole her life and buried his career forever. This isn't the story Hollywood wanted you to hear. This is the shocking truth about how the most powerful man in America became completely powerless when it mattered most. Before Chuck Norris became a legend, he was Carlos Ray Norris, a terrified kid trapped in hell. Born in 1940 in Ryan, Oklahoma, his childhood wasn't about learning to fight villains. It was about surviving one. His father, Ray Norris, came back from World War II as a completely different man. The war had broken something inside him, and he used alcohol to drown the demons that haunted him every single night. But the booze didn't kill the demons. It made them worse. Ray would come home drunk and violent, turning their house into a war zone. Chuck's mother, Wilma, would hide $5 bills just to buy food. But Ray would find them and steal them for more alcohol. The family lived like prisoners, walking on eggshells, never knowing when the next explosion would happen. The worst nights were when Ray would force the entire family into the car while he was drunk. He'd weave across the roads, threatening to drive them all back to Arizona, while Wilma begged and cried for him to stop. Chuck would sit in the back seat, watching his mother fall apart, knowing that any second they could all die because of his father's rage. When Chuck was 14, everything reached a breaking point. His father was attacking his mother, and Chuck grabbed a hammer. A terrified 14-year-old boy stood between his parents, with a weapon in his shaking hands, ready to fight the man who was supposed to protect them. That night changed everything. Chuck made a silent promise that he would never become the monster that terrorized his family. But the nightmare wasn't over. In 1956, when Chuck was 16, Wilma finally found the courage to escape. She packed up her 3 boys and fled to California, leaving behind a husband who had destroyed their family and a childhood that no kid should ever endure. In 1958, Chuck Norris was still a shy, broken 18-year-old who barely spoke to anyone. The Air Force stationed him in South Korea, and that's where everything changed. He discovered martial arts, and for the first time in his life, he found something that made sense. The discipline, the structure, the respect, everything his childhood had lacked was right there in those training sessions. Chuck wasn't naturally gifted. He was clumsy and awkward at first, but he had something most fighters didn't have: the desperate need to never feel powerless again. He practiced obsessively, falling on the mats over and over, getting back up every single time. The other soldiers would go out drinking, but Chuck would be in the dojo, perfecting his technique until his hands bled. When he returned to California in 1962, Chuck opened his first karate school. It was a tiny storefront with barely any students. Most nights he'd sweep empty floors and wonder if he'd made a terrible mistake. The money was so tight he could barely eat, but he kept going because martial arts had given him something precious, an identity that wasn't built on fear and shame. Then everything clicked. Between 1964 and 1974, Chuck Norris became the most dominant karate champion in America. He held the professional middleweight championship for 6 consecutive years. But the victories weren't just about trophies. They were proof that the scared little boy from Oklahoma had transformed himself into something unbreakable. Chuck's breakthrough came in 1972 when Bruce Lee chose him for Way of the Dragon. Their fight scene in the Roman Colosseum became legendary. But Chuck was terrified that people would only remember him as the guy Bruce Lee beat up. Instead, Hollywood noticed his intensity and screen presence. But success didn't come easy. The late 1970s were brutal. Chuck made movie after movie, but most of them flopped. While Stallone and Schwarzenegger were becoming superstars, Chuck was struggling to find his voice in Hollywood. It wasn't until 1978, with Good Guys Wear Black, that audiences finally connected with his clean-cut, disciplined hero persona. Then came the breakthrough that changed everything: Walker, Texas Ranger. For 8 seasons, Chuck embodied Cordell Walker, the Texas lawman who fought for justice with his fists and his principles. The show was broadcast in over 100 countries, making Chuck Norris a global icon. Kids wanted to be like him. Adults respected his moral code, and even the jokes and memes only made him more famous. But behind all that success was a pain that never stopped bleeding. Every time Chuck put on a military uniform for a movie, every time he portrayed a soldier, he was thinking about his younger brother, Wieland. And that memory was about to destroy him from the inside. Wieland Norris was everything Chuck wasn't: outgoing, charismatic, full of life. He was the light of the family, the one who brought laughter into rooms that had been darkened by their father's violence. But Wieland carried a darkness of his own. He once told Chuck that he didn't think he'd live to see his 27th birthday. At the time, it seemed like youthful melancholy. It turned out to be a prophecy. In 1970, Private First Class Wieland Norris was serving with the 101st Airborne Division in Vietnam. On June 3rd, while walking point on a patrol, Wieland spotted enemy forces lying in wait. He shouted a warning to save his fellow soldiers, exposing his position and sacrificing his own life. He was 27 years old. For his heroism, he was posthumously awarded the Silver Star. The telegram that arrived at the Norris home shattered everything. Chuck was building his martial arts career, but none of it mattered anymore. His baby brother, the one who had survived their father's violence and their mother's tears, was gone forever, killed in a jungle thousands of miles away, dying to save strangers, while his family fell apart at home. Chuck dedicated his missing in action films to Wieland's memory, but it wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. Every military role, every action scene, every moment of staged combat brought back the crushing reality that his brother had faced real bullets and real death, while Chuck was pretending to be a hero on movie sets. After years of loneliness following his divorce, Chuck found happiness again with Gina O'Kelly. She was 23 years younger, a former model who brought light back into his life. They married in 1998, and in 2001, they welcomed twins, Dakota and Danilee. At 61, Chuck was a father again, and for more than a decade, their home was filled with laughter and joy. But in 2013, everything changed. Gina underwent what should have been a routine MRI scan. The contrast agent used in the procedure was gadolinium, a chemical designed to make the images clearer. Instead, it nearly killed her. Gina developed gadolinium deposition disease, a condition so rare that most doctors had never heard of it. The symptoms were terrifying. Gina's body began to shake violently. Her limbs went numb. Her muscles weakened until she could barely walk. Her speech became slurred and difficult. The vibrant, healthy woman Chuck loved was disappearing before his eyes, replaced by someone who seemed to be slowly dying from the inside out. Chuck watched his wife suffer, and there was nothing he could do. No amount of training, no martial arts technique, no movie star power could fight this invisible enemy. Gina would lie in bed, her body racked with pain, while Chuck held her hand and tried not to let her see him crying. The medical bills were staggering. Chuck spent over $2 million searching for treatments. They traveled to China for experimental stem cell therapy. They tried every specialist, every treatment, every desperate hope they could find. Nothing worked. Gina continued to deteriorate, while Chuck watched helplessly. In 2017, Chuck did something unthinkable. He walked away from his career. The man who had been making movies for 40 years, who had built an empire worth tens of millions of dollars, abandoned everything to become a full-time caregiver for his wife. Walker, Texas Ranger was over. The action movies were over. Chuck Norris, the movie star, was dead. Chuck and Gina filed a lawsuit against the manufacturers of gadolinium-based contrast agents, claiming that the chemical had poisoned her and destroyed their lives. The lawsuit revealed the shocking extent of Gina's suffering: burning pain throughout her body, kidney damage, cognitive problems that left her confused and disoriented. But the legal system that Chuck had portrayed as heroic in his movies turned out to be slow, complicated, and heartbreaking. In 2022, after years of fighting, Chuck voluntarily abandoned the lawsuit. The companies denied responsibility, the medical establishment closed ranks, and the Norris family was left to deal with the consequences alone. The twins, Dakota and Danilee, were only 12 when their mother became ill. Instead of normal teenage years, they grew up watching their father cry and their mother suffer. They saw the man who was supposed to be invincible break down completely, and that changed them forever. Their childhood was stolen, just like Chuck's had been, but this time it was disease, not violence, that destroyed their family's happiness. Chuck had always believed that if you fought hard enough, if you were disciplined enough, if you never gave up, you could overcome anything. But gadolinium poisoning wasn't an opponent he could roundhouse kick. It wasn't a villain he could defeat with his fists. It was invisible, relentless, and completely beyond his control. Today, Chuck Norris lives quietly on his ranch in Navasota, Texas. The property is worth millions, and he has an estimated net worth of $70 million. But none of that money can buy back what he's lost. At 85, he's not the invincible warrior the world remembers. He's an elderly man caring for his sick wife, watching his own body betray him with age and arthritis. Gina has stabilized somewhat, but she's never fully recovered. Chuck remains by her side constantly, afraid to leave her alone, even for short periods. The man who once commanded movie sets and packed arenas now spends his days helping his wife with basic tasks, measuring his victories not in box office receipts, but in small moments of improvement in her condition. The ranch is quiet, except for the sound of horses and the wind through the trees. Chuck still supports his Kickstart Kids program, teaching martial arts to at-risk children, but his public appearances are rare. The spotlight he once commanded now feels like a burden from another lifetime. His twins are now 24, young adults shaped not by red carpets and Hollywood glamour, but by years of watching their mothers suffer, and their fathers sacrifice everything for love. They understand that real heroism isn't what happens on movie screens. It's what happens in hospital rooms and at bedside vigils when no one is watching. Chuck Norris spent his entire life fighting. He fought his father's violence. He fought poverty. He fought his way to championships. He fought for roles in Hollywood, and he fought to become a legend. But the fight that defined him wasn't against any opponent the world could see. It was the fight to save his wife from an enemy no amount of strength could defeat. The man who became famous for never losing finally lost the most important battle of his life. And in that loss, he revealed what real heroism actually looks like. Not the flashy victories that make headlines, but the quiet devotion that keeps going, even when hope is gone. Chuck Norris isn't the invincible warrior anymore. He's something much more human and much more heartbreaking. A husband who gave up everything for love. A father haunted by the children he couldn't protect. A brother still grieving a loss from 50 years ago. The legend the world created was never real. The broken man caring for his sick wife, that's who Chuck Norris really is. And maybe that's the most heroic thing of all.